What's up guys, Asian here again with another video, and today we're going to be taking a look at the update 22 combat direction post that was made by the new combat lead, Brian Wheeler. So this was posted a little bit earlier as of the recording of this video, so this would be April 4th. So this it's just kind of an update to the community from the ZOS, Brian Wheeler, who is now the lead combat developer since the departure of Roble. So let's go ahead and kind of see what he has to say. So update 22 is elsewhere. So this is the kind of change that we can expect to see in elsewhere in a few weeks. So the PTS is coming out on April 15th. So this will kind of give us an idea of what to anticipate coming out of that PTS. So he mentions PTS coming to the PTS. PTS coming to the PTS. With update 22 coming to the PTS in just a few weeks, we want to give you all an update on how we're approaching combat adjustments this patch. So, dive into how we're approaching the Elsewhere update. First off, we are getting the Necromancer ready for prime time. This class is created with three major tenets of play. So the first tenet, create a class that feels entirely unique and different from any other class in ESO. The second tenet is create a class that embodies necromancy and Elder Scrolls lore and canon. And the third is to add new gameplay elements via corpses, temporary pets, and emphasize positional gameplay. So just based on these three tenets, just based on what we've seen so far from Necromancer, it seems pretty good that they've covered Tenet 1 pretty decently. It definitely seems and feels very unique. There's really no other class in the game right now that really has this sort of corpse mechanic or anything like that. It's definitely accomplished Tenet 1, so it remains to be seen whether they accomplish Tenet 3, and I don't really know that much about... while I am interested in Elder Scrolls lore, I am not a lore buff, so I'm not really sure about how well they've managed to cover Tenet 2. So we'll see how well they manage to accomplish, or I should say incorporate Tenet 3 into the overall gameplay of the Necromancer. So they did mention in the next paragraph that the Necromancer was looked over by a couple of players before it was kind of given the gloss over by the class reps. And then members of the community. So the class reps and a couple of other people did go over to the studio and kind of play through the Necromancer to kind of give them feedback as to how those abilities would play out overall. And this was back, they were covered by NDA, so this NDA was lifted a few days ago, so this is pretty much everything that has basically been happening since then. So that feedback was used, according to Brian Wheeler, to kind of help the development process and kind of reshape whatever abilities they had prior to the NDA lifting to what we see today after the NDA was lifted here. Now, of course, all this does remain to be seen on the PTS, how this all plays out, whether they took the feedback in a positive direction or a negative direction, whether they took the correct levels of feedback or whether they took the wrong levels of feedback. So remember that feedback, for those of you guys who are, are in a position where you either receive or give feedback, feedback is definitely sort of a double-edged sword. It really depends on whether the person is able to communicate relevant feedback and feedback that is going to be beneficial, and it's up to the person who receives the feedback to actually make use of that feedback, interpret it correctly, and make the appropriate adjustments based on that feedback. Any sort of breakdown in that communication, whether that's from the person giving the feedback, not really understanding the kind of the developer's sort of mindset, their goals, or just not understanding kind of how game mechanics work is another big thing. Right down to the developers taking meaningful feedback and acting on them appropriately. So rather than, a very common thing you might see on the forums is buff this, nerf this, but they don't really give a reason behind why an ability should be nerfed, why a class should be buffed, or something like that. That's not really good feedback to give back because it doesn't really say anything specific. Something more specific might be like, well, Nightblades are very strong in PvE because of Relentless Focus and Merciless Resolve, granting them pretty much 100% uptime on Minor Berserk, where there's only one other class in the game that provides that, and that's going to be the Warden. So that would be a more targeted feedback, which would be something that developers might be able to act upon more readily because it's more specific. It actually identifies what the pain point is, and so on. So hopefully the class reps and the members of the community that did visit the studio and gave that feedback did so in a meaningful way, in a way that the developers were able to make use of. And of course, on the PTS, myself and a lot of other endgame PvE players will definitely be taking a look at the Necromancer, working on rotations, testing them out in trials to kind of see where the Necromancer stacks up and how it feels and balances compared to the other classes. That's all the Necromancer stuff. So everything else here is basically looking at combat as a whole. So over the years of development, there have been numerous changes to class abilities, both in function and under the hood with code. These changes have shaped the face of combat in ESO over time, but as the game has evolved with each passing year, we have accrued many changes that have fallen out of vogue. With this update, we are making several adjustments to bring abilities back in line with the current state of the game and create a solid foundation of standards for the future. So it sounds like they are kind of taking an approach where they are trying to adjust to the changing nature of the game, which is very true. The game that was released 5 years ago was very, very different from what the game is now. The changes from Morrowind to elsewhere, it's been a huge shift in sort of the meta overall. Back when Major Force used to stack multiplicatively, they were running high crit builds. When Morrowind came out, we were running more spell damage builds, and we were running Sharpen on the front bar. We were basically trying to get more penetration out of our builds. It was easier to get penetration, I should say. And then with Qualms of the Reach, we decided, the changes to the Munda Stones and changes to the weapon traits. I saw another major shift. So I like the approach that they are recognizing that the meta shifts, whether that's in PvP or in PvE, and they are trying to sort of update these abilities so that way they're at the very least staying more or less relevant to what the game is currently at. So in update 22, we have done a pass on every class ability looking for errant or missing data. We've also made sure abilities follow a coherent pattern of rank progression that is easy to identify. For example, if an ability morph does damage, the rank progression adds more damage. If an ability morph does healing, the rank progression does more healing. So this is something that I'm not sure a lot of people sort of recognize. So each ability, as you level it up from, I'm just using surprise attack 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, it does one of two things. So abilities basically either, as you level them up, it reduces the cost, or it increases the damage or the healing that's done, and it's sort of inconsistent. So some abilities that do damage, when you level them up, they reduce the cost. For other abilities, it increases the damage you do. So a little bit of inconsistency there, so it's nice that they're able to, make something a little bit more consistent that way. So ability coefficients and costs have also been audited to ensure that healing or damage within the type of ability, such as a direct damage, damage over time, heal over time, direct heal, are more consistent. Duration of abilities and sub-effects have been normalized so they adhere to patterns that fall in line with the playstyle of ESO, making their use in rotations easier to handle. Then they give an example here. So, single target dots have been a long-standing group of abilities that were not consistent in their application of damage. Looking at these types of abilities' durations, tick frequencies, and delays, a consistent pattern of application was missing from ability to ability. Some of these abilities have even been used as spammable abilities, Searing Strike, despite that being against their design. In this pass, we restructured them to follow a standard behavior. If there's an initial hit upon casting one of these abilities, there will always be a delay between the initial hit and the first tick. If there is no initial hit, there will be no delay. Delays, in other words, an ability that doesn't hit immediately, will always be the same duration as the dot's frequency in which it ticks. So it just seems like they're sort of streamlining each sort of class of ability. So remember that abilities basically fall as direct damage or damage over time, or if you're healing over time versus a direct heal. So it just seems like with this sort of pass through, they're trying to standardize the abilities so that way they all follow a certain pattern. That'll make it a little bit easier, it'll standardize it a little bit, and I think their goal is to sort of basically make everything consistent so it's a little bit easier to make rotations that way. And that's certainly something that is going to be very nice, especially for newer players where you kind of have to learn the intricacies of each ability. So for example, Endless Hail is a very, very common example of a dot that is not very consistent with other bow abilities. So all the other bow abilities, if is a dot associated with it, it pretty much gets applied right away. But Endless Hail, it has a 2-second sort of charge up time where it actually doesn't do any damage at all. You just have to wait for it to actually start doing damage. So rotations have kind of been built around that ever since the changes to the Maelstrom weapons, so that Endless Hail is the first ability that you use in your rotation in order to get that charge up time, that wind up time going. In the past, Endless Hail was actually the last ability used in the rotation, so you can bar swap cancel out of that casting animation instead. And then you also run into the problem of poison injection. So poison injection, I'm assuming that when they say application of damage, they're also taking a look at how abilities inherit penetration, weapon damage, things like that. So ground dots, for instance, will inherit pretty much all these stats of whatever bar you're currently on, versus some single target abilities, poison injection, for example. It will inherit the weapon damage of whatever bar it was cast on, and whichever bar it managed to take on first. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there, so I like the idea that they're bringing a little bit more consistency. It will basically give us theory crafters sort of something else to work with and make basically theory crafting rotations a little bit easier, because now we know, okay, all damage over time abilities of a certain type will always do their damage in this manner. So this definitely will kind of making rotations a little bit easier that way. Next were abilities that were considered out of standards based on the audit pass noted above. Some abilities contained a lot of functionality, so they use incapacitating strike as an example, and others not as much, so teleport strike was the example they used here. When looking at abilities across the board, moving forward, abilities with the same, quote, category should have a base level of performance, but also have something that makes it unique. In doing this pass, we found abilities that had components which were above or below base functionality and made adjustments to bring them in line. In some cases, base damage and healing has been increased to make up for the removal of additional functions. In other cases, base damage and healing has been reduced to make up for adding in additional functions. So just taking a look at this, basically what I'm pulling away from this is that they sort of established some sort of baseline, and this is sort of the baseline which they judged every single ability in the game, in this case class abilities. So for example, incapacitating strike has, in their opinion, a lot of functionality, and I could definitely see it. So it has an increased damage received debuff, it has major defile, I believe, or some sort of defile. It has a stun if you use it at 120 ultimate or higher, so that's a lot of functionality in an ultimate, a fairly cheap ultimate ability. So it's nice to see that they sort of have this sort of standard, even if it's a very opaque standard. So we don't even know what the sort of base level of performance is that they're using to judge it on. Is it some sort of damage? Is it some sort of, how many effects can it apply? Is it how much healing it can do? How much damage it can do in a given span of time if you just spam the ability? So there's a little bit of opaqueness there when it comes to what the base level of performance is actually defined as, and I wish they were a little bit more open about that, because that, if they were just a little bit open on what they considered base level, PvP and PvE players would be able to kind of give them feedback as to, that base level might be a little bit too low to judge things off of, it might be a little bit too high to judge things off of, and it might be that maybe different types of abilities shouldn't have the same base level of performance. This is an argument that you see in a lot of different aspects of life, that taking the average is not always going to be great. So, for example, income in America. You can take an average income across the entire United States, but that might not necessarily be a good standard to use if you wanted to use income to establish some sort of nationwide policy or something like that, because every state might have different income laws, like tax laws or things like that. Different communities might have different levels of income. So a good example might be something like New York City or any of the big cities, where you might have a lot of rich people within the inner city, but once you get out of the inner city you see a lot of poverty all of a sudden. So just because you have this sort of base level of performance doesn't necessarily mean that it should be applied to each sort of subcategory, so to speak. So I hope that there's a little bit more transparency as to what base level performance actually means, because just from a PvE perspective, a base level performance for damage over time abilities should not necessarily be the same as a base level of performance as a direct damage ability or a buff ability. So I do wish they were a little bit more transparent here, but it is nice to see that they, at the very least, are kind of standardizing things to kind of make sure that they're all sort of starting or based off of this same level, rather than, this sort of haphazard thing that they have currently going here. The last line here, so the base damage and healing increasing or decreasing to make up for removal or addition of certain functions, does tell me that they are going to be doing quite a couple of probably major changes to a couple of abilities here, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do to kind of bring some of the lower performing abilities up to speed, and try to tone down the higher performing abilities here. So they took a high-level pass at class abilities, specifically looking for similar or redundant functions within each class's entire toolkit, like Mark Target granting Fracture and Surprise Attack granting Fracture. While we want there to be different abilities that operate similarly in functionality between your class, weapon, guild, and other skill lines, we want to avoid abilities within the same class to provide multiple sources of the same effects. This is an ongoing effort to future skill lines, and we are not opposed to revisiting the structure of abilities that have already received this audit. Also note these passes were done in conjunction with the changes noted above regarding coefficient, cost, rank progression, etc. So just based on this, it does seem like they are going to be removing redundant functions. So in this example of mark target and surprise attack, I wouldn't be surprised, no pun intended, if they decided to remove major fracture from surprise attack. That just seems like what the logical thing would do if they wanted to make it so only one ability in the Nightblade line granted major fracture. I would probably just say, let's keep it for mark target instead, if I was a game developer. This could be good, and this could be bad. There are definitely some abilities that do sort of overlap in terms of functionality. So, for example, if you're a Stamina Nightblade, there's not really much reason to use Mark Target in PvE because you don't need the invisibility break. It costs magicka to use. Instead, you would use Surprise Attack instead because it grants you major fracture and it deals damage. So it is definitely something that I can see being a concern from a developer's point of view. Of course, this does mean that some of our abilities that we commonly use in PvP and PvE might end up seeing changes. I'm going to say changes here because I don't know if it's going to be a buff or a nerf. So for example, for the surprise attack, it's definitely going to be a nerf if they take away the major fracture, but other abilities might be buffed if for some reason they say we need to include this sort of a buff, so this sort of functionality, so we're just giving it to this ability. So there's definitely going to be some changes here, and some of them might not necessarily be for the better. In terms of quality of life changes, we've heard your feedback about cast times being difficult to incorporate into fluid combat and rotations, and have made adjustments to many abilities with cast times to make them easier to weave and be more reliable. In most of these cases, we've adjusted the damage as well in coordination with cast time adjustments to retain the DPS you're used to in Update 21. So there was a leaked change for Snipe, which is the first bow ability, that they were taking the cast time from 1.1 seconds down to 1 second. So this is kind of what they're sort of standardizing here. They're taking out basically that sort of like 0.1 with things like jabs and snipe, just making cast times more consistent. So their idea here is, again, sort of to standardize things, which is always nice to have. So obviously there's going to be patch notes for the PTS, but they did give us one ability that they've reworked mostly. So Cleave, which is a two-handed skill, two-handed ability, I believe it's a third ability in the skill line. They increased the damage by 50%, but removed the bleed from this base ability completely. Carve retains the bleed, and it has increased the bleed damage by 25%, but it no longer grants minor heroism. Brawler removed the bleed entirely, but they increased the shield granted from this morph by 100% at base, but reduced the bonus scaling per target hit from 100% to 50%. This means at base, this ability will be 100% stronger than before, and will be about 14% stronger than previously if you get the maximum bonus. So just based on this, we can see that they're definitely going to be going through a lot of the abilities here, and it's not necessarily going to be isolated just to class abilities. So again, Cleave is a two-handed ability. So I am anticipating the first patch notes for the PTS to be very, very long, very lengthy, and I'm anticipating pretty much no ability has gone untouched. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. So like just from this alone, I can tell you right now that this definitely has implications for PvP and PvE. Obviously, for the bleed damage for PvP, you're going to be using Carve now, obviously, not Brawler. And also for PvE, with the changes to the one-handed enchant nerf, as now that they've increased the damage to Clave and the bleed damage from Carve, two-handed builds might actually end up beating out dual-wield builds. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out, depending on the other changes they made to the active abilities. So overall, I am definitely looking forward to what they've done. I am excited to see kind of how they've changed different abilities. I am a little bit apprehensive because of Zos's sort of pattern of nerfing things rather than buffing things. They have done a few buffs here and there, but a lot of game development is sort of bringing things down, overperforming things down rather than bringing things up, which is fine because obviously you want to combat power creep, but I am a little bit apprehensive, particularly with that whole surprise attack granting major fracture thing, as well as some of the other sort of leaked changes that have happened that have been noted here. Noted not here, but in other discords. So again, we'll have to wait and see when the PTS goes live on April 15th to kind of test things out, to examine the changes and sort of make conclusions, do rotations, and basically just do a bunch of dummy humping, essentially, in order to see whether they have really listened to player feedback and things like that. So that is it for this video. I will have a link down in the description to this forum. If you have a forum account, you can definitely, I recommend when the PTS goes live, if you have access to the elsewhere PTS, to definitely give feedback to the devs and make sure that your feedback is specific and is actionable. So don't put down something like please nerf surprise attack. Put down something like please buff please buff whatever the other morph of Comet Prayer is, because nobody uses that morph or something like that. So yeah, that's it for this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.